We do not sell diamonds to people who cannot even pronounce their value. The laughter that followed was not loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the polished silence of the showroom, slipping between glass cases filled with million-dollar stones and settling directly in front of Marcus Ellington, who stood just inside the entrance as if he had been expected to turn around the moment he stepped in. But he did not move, not a step, not a shift, not even a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. And that stillness, quiet and controlled, contrasted so completely with the environment around him that it made the moment feel heavier than it should have been, because everything in that space was designed to impress. The marble floors reflecting soft white light, the air scented faintly with expensive cologne and polished wood, the display cases arranged with precision like a gallery of untouchable wealth. And standing behind one of those cases, Chad Whitmore leaned slightly forward, one hand resting casually against the glass, his smile no longer hidden as he looked Marcus up and down, taking in the simple black hoodie, the worn-in sneakers, the lack of anything that signaled status in a place that measured worth by what could be seen at a glance. "You are in the wrong place, man," Chad added, his tone smoother now, but no less dismissive, as if he had already decided the outcome of this interaction before it began, and a couple browsing a nearby display glanced over, curiosity turning into quiet amusement as they watched the exchange unfold, the woman raising an eyebrow while the man gave a faint chuckle under his breath, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to reinforce the tone that had already been set. And Marcus noticed all of it, every glance, every shift in posture, every subtle confirmation that the room had aligned itself against him without needing to say a word, and still, he did not react, because reaction was not what he came here for. And that was the part no one in the room understood yet, because to them, this was a transaction space, a place where people came to prove they could afford what was behind the glass. But for Marcus, this was something else entirely, something quieter, something deeper, something that had already begun long before he walked through the door. And he took one slow step forward, not toward Chad, not toward the nearest display, but into the space itself, as if claiming presence without needing permission, and Chad's expression shifted just slightly, the smile tightening at the edges as he straightened his posture. "We do appointments only for pieces in that range," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a section of the showroom where the lighting grew even softer, even more exclusive, as if the diamonds there required a different kind of air. "And I can already tell you are not on the list," and the certainty in his voice landed with finality, like a door closing before it had ever been opened. And Marcus let the words settle, not pushing against them, not challenging them, just allowing them to exist exactly as they were. And for a moment the room returned to its quiet rhythm, soft footsteps, low conversations, the subtle hum of wealth moving without interruption. But beneath that surface something had already shifted, something almost invisible, like a line being drawn that no one else could see yet. And Marcus reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not defensive, just precise, his fingers brushing against his phone as if confirming something that had already been decided. And when he lifted his gaze again, it was not toward the diamonds, not toward the displays, but directly at Chad Whitmore, steady and unshaken. And in that look there was no request, no apology, no hesitation, only the quiet certainty of someone who did not need to prove anything to anyone in the room, because the truth of why he was there had never depended on their recognition in the first place. Marcus Ellington did not answer the laughter. He let it exist in the space exactly as it was, unchallenged, uncorrected, and that was what made it linger longer than it should have, because most people either defend themselves or walk away. But Marcus did neither. He simply stood there with a calm that did not belong to the situation Chad Whitmore had created, and that calm began to draw attention in a different way, subtle at first, like a shift in air pressure that no one could quite explain. And Chad noticed it, even if he could not name it, his fingers tapping lightly against the glass display as he tried to regain control of a moment that no longer felt as simple as it had seconds before. "Look, we get people coming in all the time just to look," he said, his tone softening slightly but still layered with condescension. "But these pieces are not for browsing," and he gestured toward a necklace resting under a focused beam of light, its price tag discreet but unmistakably high, the kind of number that most people would not say out loud. and Marcus followed the gesture briefly, his eyes resting on the diamonds not with awe, not with hesitation, but with familiarity, as if he had seen value like this before in places that did not require glass to protect it. And that was the moment something shifted again. Because recognition does not always come from words. Sometimes it comes from the absence of reaction, and a woman standing near the far counter lowered her phone slightly, her expression narrowing as she studied Marcus more closely, trying to reconcile the way he carried himself with the narrative that had already been assigned to him. While a junior sales associate behind the counter glanced down at a tablet, scrolling quickly as if searching for something that had just slipped into his awareness, and Chad caught that movement, his attention snapping back toward his staff, irritation flashing briefly across his face before he masked it again. "We have procedures here," he added, louder now, projecting control not just at Marcus, but at the room. "And if you do not have an appointment, I am going to have to ask you to step out." And there it was again, the assumption disguised as policy, the boundary drawn not by rules but by perception, and Marcus let the words settle, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing them to reveal exactly what they were. And then he took another step forward, slow, deliberate, closing just enough distance to make it clear he had heard everything and chosen not to comply. And Chad reacted immediately, his body shifting, shoulders tightening, one hand lifting slightly as if to reinforce the invisible line he believed he controlled. "Do not make this uncomfortable," he said, and the irony of the statement hung in the air for a fraction of a second too long. Because discomfort had already been introduced, just not by the person he was addressing, and Marcus reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out his phone, the movement smooth, unhurried, and for the first time Chad's expression changed in a way he could not fully control, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through the confidence he had been maintaining, because this was not how these situations usually went. People either argued or left. They did not remain composed and initiate something unseen, and around them the room had gone quieter, conversations thinning, attention consolidating into a single point, because even without understanding the full context, people could feel that something about this moment was no longer aligned with the assumptions it began with. And Marcus glanced at his screen briefly before typing a single line, his thumb pressing send without hesitation, and then he lowered the phone again, his gaze returning to Chad, steady, unshaken, and completely indifferent to the performance of authority still unfolding in front of him, as if the real decision had already been made somewhere beyond the walls of the showroom, and all that remained now was for it to arrive. The message Marcus Ellington had sent did not announce itself. There was no sound, no immediate reaction, no visible shift that anyone in the showroom could point to. And that was exactly what made the next few seconds feel different, because nothing happened, and yet something had already begun, subtle, quiet, moving through systems no one in the room could see. And Chad Whitmore misread that silence instantly, his confidence returning in small but noticeable increments as he straightened his jacket and exhaled through his nose. "That is what I thought," he said, his tone settling back into dismissal. "You can make all the calls you want. It does not change policy." And the word policy landed heavier than before, because now it sounded less like a rule and more like a shield. Something he was holding on to as the ground beneath him began to shift in ways he could not yet detect. And Marcus did not respond. He did not need to, because his role in the moment was no longer reactive. It was already complete, and that absence of response started to draw more attention than any argument could have. The woman near the far counter stepping slightly closer now, her earlier amusement replaced by curiosity, while the junior associate who had been scrolling through the tablet stopped entirely, his eyes fixed on the screen as if something there had just updated without warning, his expression tightening as he read, then glanced up toward Marcus again, trying to connect what he was seeing with what was happening in front of him. And Chad noticed that too, his gaze snapping briefly toward the employee. Irritation flashing again. "Focus on your work," he said sharply, the authority in his voice returning just enough to reassert control over something. Anything. And the employee nodded quickly, but did not move, did not return to his previous task, because whatever had appeared on that screen had interrupted more than just his attention. And then, almost imperceptibly, another shift occurred. A faint vibration from a phone behind the counter, followed by another from across the room. Small, isolated at first, but consistent enough to form a pattern, and people began to notice, glancing down at their devices, exchanging brief looks as notifications arrived one after another, not loud, not disruptive, but coordinated in a way that felt deliberate, and Chad felt it before he understood it. A tightening in the atmosphere that made his posture stiffen, his confidence no longer expanding but holding, like it had reached a limit it could not push beyond, and Marcus remained exactly where he was, calm, grounded, his presence unchanged, because for him this was not a surprise. It was progression, the next step unfolding exactly as expected, and the junior associate finally spoke again, his voice lower now. More cautious, sir, he said, directing it toward Chad, but his eyes still. Flicking back to Marcus. There is an internal notice, and Chad frowned slightly, the words not fitting into the narrative he had been maintaining. What notice? He asked, his tone controlled but edged with something new. Uncertainty, and the associate hesitated for just a second before answering. Corporate access protocol update, he said. And the phrase hung in the air longer than it should have, because it did not belong to this kind of situation. Not here, not now. And Chad's expression tightened again, his mind trying to process something that had not yet fully revealed itself, while around them the room had grown quieter once more, not out of tension this time, but anticipation, because people could feel that the moment had shifted beyond a simple misunderstanding, that something larger was moving into place, something that would redefine what had just happened, and Marcus Ellington stood at the center of it all without moving, without speaking, because he had already done what was necessary, and now the system was beginning to speak for him. The phrase corporate access protocol update did not belong in a luxury showroom conversation, and that was exactly why it lingered, stretching across the polished floor and glass displays like something out of place that demanded attention, and Chad Whitmore felt it before he understood it. The shift no longer subtle, no longer something he could ignore or dismiss with a practiced smile, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned toward the junior associate. What exactly does that mean? He asked, his voice controlled but edged with tension that had not been there moments before, and the associate hesitated, not because he did not know, but because what he was seeing did not match what he expected, his fingers hovering over the tablet, as if the information might change if he waited long enough. It is a system-level update, he said finally, choosing his words carefully. It is restricting local access permissions, and the sentence landed heavier than it should have, because in a place like this, access was everything. It defined who could move, who could sell, who could approve, and for a brief second Chad said nothing, his mind moving quickly through possibilities that did not yet form a clear answer. And then his phone vibrated, sharp and immediate against the quiet of the room, and he pulled it out instinctively, glancing down at the screen, and whatever he saw there did not bring clarity. It brought something else entirely, something closer to confusion, because the message was not from a number he recognized. It was from a corporate system he rarely interacted with directly, and the wording was precise, cold, unmistakable. Access privileges under review. Stand by for further instruction. And Chad's expression tightened, the confidence that had carried him through the interaction beginning to fracture in small, but visible ways. And he looked up quickly, his gaze landing on Marcus Ellington again, and for the first time there was no immediate judgment in it, no dismissal, only a question he had not yet asked. And Marcus met that look without change, his posture still relaxed, his presence still grounded, as if none of this was unexpected, as if the system responding now was simply catching up to something that had already been decided. And around them the showroom had grown noticeably quieter, conversations fading as more people checked their phones, more staff members glancing toward their screens, their expressions shifting in similar patterns, confusion first, then concern, then something closer to realization, and the woman who had been watching earlier stepped back slightly, her amusement gone completely now, replaced by a focused attention that suggested she understood this was no longer a simple exchange between a customer and a manager. This was something larger, something structural, and Chad felt it fully now. The loss of control not in a dramatic collapse, but in a gradual erosion, like something he had relied on was being quietly removed piece by piece. And he tried to recover it the only way he knew how, by speaking, by reasserting. This does not change anything here, he said, louder than before. his voice cutting through the quiet in an attempt to reclaim the room. "We still have standards." But the words did not land the same way this time. They did not settle, they did not hold. Because the environment had already shifted beyond them, and Marcus took a slow step forward again, not aggressive, not confrontational, just present, and his voice when he spoke was calm, even, but now carried something unmistakable beneath it. "Standards only matter when they are applied correctly," he said, and the sentence did not challenge Chad directly. It reframed the entire moment. And that was when the weight of what was happening began to settle fully into the room, not as a reaction, but as an understanding that whatever authority had been assumed here was no longer the highest one in the space, and that realization was beginning to change everything. The words "standards only matter when they are applied correctly" did not fade after Marcus Ellington said them. They lingered, settling into the showroom with a quiet weight that shifted the entire atmosphere from controlled luxury to something far more uncertain, and Chad Whitmore felt that shift immediately, not as a dramatic loss, but as a slow erosion of the certainty he had been relying on. His eyes flicking again to his phone, as if the screen might now offer clarity instead of confusion. But before he could process anything further, another vibration came, this time sharper, followed by a second notification layered on top of the first, and then a third, each one arriving with the same precise tone, the same unmistakable source, corporate systems he had never needed to question before, and he opened the latest message quickly, his thumb moving faster now, less controlled, and the text on the screen was no longer vague, no longer something he could reinterpret to fit his narrative. It was direct, structured, final. All regional authority temporarily suspended pending executive review. And for the first time his expression changed completely, not just tightening, but breaking in a way that could not be hidden. Because authority in that space was not abstract, it was operational. It dictated everything from who could access inventory to who could finalize a sale. And without it, the role he had been performing only seconds ago no longer held the same weight. And he looked up again, this time not at Marcus immediately, but at the room, as if searching for confirmation that what he was reading was real, but the room was already responding. Staff members standing more still than before. Conversations gone entirely now. Every movement slowed by the understanding that something fundamental had just shifted, and the junior associate stepped slightly forward again, his voice careful, almost hesitant. "Sir, the system is locking several permissions," he said, holding the tablet in a way that made it clear he was no longer just observing, he was reporting. And Chad shook his head instinctively. A small motion at first, denial more than rejection. "That is not possible," he said, but the words lacked the force they had carried earlier, because the evidence was no longer external, it was in his own hands, and Marcus remained exactly where he was, unchanged, his presence steady in the center of a moment that was no longer defined by confrontation but by revelation. And he watched without urgency, without satisfaction, simply allowing the system to continue unfolding. Because this was not about proving anything. It was about exposing something that had already existed beneath the surface. And Chad finally looked at him again. Truly looked this time. Not scanning his clothes, not judging his appearance, but trying to understand the connection between the man standing in front of him and the messages that were now dismantling his authority piece by piece. And the question formed silently before he spoke it. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty, and Marcus did not answer immediately. He let the question sit, let it carry its full weight, because the answer was no longer something that needed to be said outright. It was already being delivered through every notification, every locked permission, every shift in posture around them. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but now carried a clarity that cut through the remaining confusion. "I am the reason your system just changed," he said, and the sentence did not raise itself. It did not push. It simply existed as truth. And that truth settled into the room in a way nothing else had, because it did not require belief. It was already being confirmed in real time. And the showroom that had once been defined by controlled elegance now stood in a quiet, undeniable transition, where the lines of authority had moved, and everyone present could feel exactly where they now led. The sentence, "I am the reason your system just changed," did not echo loudly. It did not need to, because its impact was already unfolding across every device in the showroom. And Chad Whitmore felt it fully now, not as confusion, but as realization slowly locking into place, his grip tightening slightly around his phone as another notification appeared. This one more detailed, more structured, impossible to reinterpret. Executive override confirmed. All managerial authority suspended pending review. And the words did not just sit on the screen. They translated immediately into the room itself, into the way staff members shifted their posture, into the way the junior associate no longer looked to Chad for instruction, but instead held his position, waiting, watching, as if the chain of command had quietly rerouted without announcement. And Chad's mouth opened slightly before he closed it again, the response he had been ready to deliver no longer fitting the situation he was standing in. And he looked around once more, searching for something stable, something that had not changed, but everything had, subtly but completely, because authority in that space had never been about volume. It had been about access, about control over systems that now no longer answered to him. And Marcus Ellington remained exactly where he was, still, composed, his presence no longer questioned, no longer misread, but not yet fully understood either, because what he represented in that moment was larger than identity. It was structure, ownership, decision, and he allowed that understanding to build naturally, without rushing to explain it, without stepping forward to claim it, because the system was already doing that work for him. And then another phone rang, this time not a notification but a direct call, sharp and immediate, cutting through the silence. And it was not just one, it was two, then three, staff members glancing down at their screens, hesitating before answering, their expressions shifting in the same pattern, surprise first, then seriousness, then compliance. And the junior associate answered his call quietly, stepping slightly aside, his voice low but clear enough for fragments to carry. Yes. Understood, effective immediately. And those words settled into the space with more weight than any announcement could have, because they confirmed what everyone was beginning to realize, that this was not a temporary glitch, not a misunderstanding, but an active decision being executed in real time. And Chad's phone rang next, the screen displaying a corporate line he could not ignore, and for a moment he hesitated, just a fraction of a second, before answering, his voice lower now, controlled but no longer confident. "This is Chad," he said, and the response on the other end came quickly, direct, leaving no room for interpretation, and whatever he heard there changed him completely, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in the small details, the way his shoulders dropped slightly, the way his eyes shifted away from Marcus for the first time, the way the authority he had been projecting dissolved into something quieter, something uncertain. And when he ended the call, he did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, processing a reality that had already moved past him. And Marcus finally took a step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just present. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm it had from the beginning. But now it held something else as well, something undeniable. "It is not personal," he said. "It's structural." And the distinction mattered, because it reframed everything that had just happened, removing emotion, removing argument, leaving only the system and the choices made within it. And the showroom stood still around them, no longer a place of controlled luxury, but a space where authority had been exposed, corrected, and reassigned in a way no one there would forget. The words, "It is not personal, it is structural," settled into the showroom with a clarity that no one could ignore. And for a moment no one spoke, not because they were unsure what to say, but because they understood that whatever came next was no longer about opinion. It was about consequence. And Chad Whitmore stood there with his phone still in his hand. The call already ended, but its impact still unfolding across his expression, the confidence that had defined him earlier now replaced by something quieter, something unsettled, as if he was trying to locate the version of himself that had existed just minutes ago and could no longer find it. And around him the staff had shifted fully, no longer looking to him for direction, no longer waiting for his approval, their attention divided between their screens and Marcus Ellington. Not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that the authority in the room had moved, and Marcus did not rush that realization. He did not step forward to dominate it. He simply allowed it to complete itself, because realignment did not require force, it required clarity, and clarity had already arrived. And then another message appeared across multiple devices at once. Not staggered this time, but synchronized, a unified update that carried more weight than the notifications before it. And the junior associate read it first, his voice barely above a whisper, but steady enough to be heard. Executive directive. Immediate personnel review initiated. And the phrase hung in the air with a finality that no one could misinterpret. Because personnel review in this context did not mean discussion, it meant decision. And Chad's eyes closed briefly, just for a second, as if he was absorbing the full scope of what had just been set in motion. And when he opened them again, he looked directly at Marcus, not with challenge, not with dismissal, but with a question that had shifted completely from earlier. You are the one making that call, he said, not asking anymore, but confirming. And Marcus met his gaze with the same steady calm he had carried from the beginning, his voice even, controlled, and undeniable. No, he said, and the single word created a pause before he continued. The system is making the call based on what it just witnessed, and that distinction landed deeper than anything else, because it removed personal conflict entirely. It reframed the situation as something larger than two individuals, something rooted in standards that had been violated in plain view. And the room understood it, not intellectually at first, but instinctively, because they had all seen it, the laughter, the dismissal, the assumptions presented as policy, and now they were watching the response unfold in real time, not through argument, but through structure. And Chad's posture shifted again, not collapsing, but recalibrating, his shoulders lowering slightly as the last pieces of resistance gave way to acceptance. And the woman who had been observing earlier stepped back completely now, her expression no longer curious but reflective, as if she was reassessing not just the moment, but her role within it. And Marcus finally moved forward one more step, closing the distance fully, not to confront, not to dominate, but to stand exactly where he had been denied at the beginning. And when he spoke again, his voice carried no anger, no satisfaction, only precision. You laughed, he said. The words simple, direct, that was the first signal, and he let the silence follow, allowing the meaning to settle completely, because this was no longer about reaction. It was about accountability, and the showroom, once defined by controlled luxury, now stood as a space where every action had been observed, recorded, and answered in a way no one present would forget. The words "that was the first signal" did not invite a response. They concluded something that had already been decided, and the silence that followed was no longer tense. It was settled, like the room itself had accepted that the moment had crossed a point of no return. And then the system moved again, not subtly this time, not in scattered notifications, but in a coordinated sequence that unfolded across every device in the showroom. Screens lighting up in near unison, messages arriving with a clarity that removed all remaining doubt. Immediate suspension of all current management roles pending executive audit. And the phrasing was precise, final, leaving no space for interpretation or delay. And the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not chaotic, but definitive. As if an invisible line had been redrawn through the structure of the room. And Chad Whitmore felt it fully now. Not as confusion, not as resistance, but as consequence, his phone lowering slowly in his hand as the meaning settled into place. His authority no longer something he could reclaim with words or posture, because it had already been reassigned at a level he could not reach. And around him the staff responded in quiet synchronization, devices lowered, positions adjusted, not in panic, but in compliance, because the system they operated within had spoken clearly. And there was no ambiguity in what it required, and Marcus Ellington remained still at the center of it, his presence unchanged, not expanding, not dominating, simply existing as the point around which everything had shifted. And that stillness carried more weight now than any movement could have, because it made one thing undeniable. This was never about confrontation. It was about exposure, and Chad looked at him again, not searching this time, not questioning, but acknowledging something he could no longer deny. And for a brief moment the space between them held a different kind of tension, not built on misunderstanding, but on clarity. And Marcus stepped forward just enough to stand where he had first been. Stopped, his position no longer contested, no longer questioned, and he spoke again, his voice calm, steady, but now carrying the full authority of what had just been executed. "It is not about the diamond," he said, the words simple, direct. "It is about how you decided who was allowed to see it." And the statement reframed the entire moment one final time, shifting the focus away from product, away from status, and directly onto the behavior that had triggered everything that followed. And the room understood it completely, because they had all witnessed that decision in real time. The laughter, the dismissal, the assumption presented as certainty. And now they were witnessing the response, not as punishment, but as correction, structural, immediate, and irreversible. And Chad's posture settled into stillness, not defeated, but changed, the realization complete, because what had just happened could not be undone or explained away. It had been recorded, processed, and answered by the very system he once represented. And Marcus Ellington stood in the space that had been denied to him, not claiming it, not celebrating it, simply occupying it with a presence that made everything else in the room realign around him. The room did not return to what it was before. Even as the lights remained the same and the diamonds continued to catch reflections in perfect silence, something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone by time or explained away by policy, and Marcus Ellington stood at the center of that shift without moving, his presence no longer questioned, no longer interpreted, simply recognized for what it had always been, and around him the showroom had fallen into a quiet that carried understanding rather than tension, because everyone present had witnessed the full arc of what had happened, from assumption to exposure to consequence. And there was no part of it that could be denied, and Chad Whitmore remained where he stood, his posture no longer rigid, no longer performative, but still, as if he had stepped out of the role he once held and had not yet found where to stand without it. And his eyes lifted once more toward Marcus, not searching, not challenging, but acknowledging something he had failed to see when it mattered most. And Marcus met that look without judgment, without satisfaction, only clarity. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, measured, carrying the final weight of everything that had unfolded. "This was never about access," he said, the words quiet, but precise. It was about assumption, and the distinction settled into the space with a finality that did not require repetition, because everyone there understood exactly what it meant. They had seen the assumption. They had watched it take shape in real time, and they had witnessed the system respond to it without hesitation. And Marcus took a slow step forward, not toward anyone, not toward anything specific, but into the space itself, as if claiming nothing and yet redefining everything simply by being there. And his gaze moved briefly across the staff, the guests, the observers who had become part of the moment whether they intended to or not. And there was no anger in it, no need to correct or instruct. Only recognition of what had been revealed. And then he spoke one final time, his tone unchanged, calm, controlled, but carrying a clarity that would remain long after he left. "You did not lose authority because of me," he said, and the words held, drawing every ounce of attention without force. "You lost it because you decided who deserved it before you knew who you were standing in front of." And the statement landed not as punishment, but as truth. Simple, direct, and irreversible, and no one responded, not because they could not, but because there was nothing left to say. The moment had completed itself fully, and Marcus Ellington turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same measured control he had carried from the beginning, walking past the displays, past the glass cases, past the space that had once tried to define him. And as he moved toward the exit, the room did not follow. It remained still, absorbing, understanding, because what had just happened was not just a reversal. It was a standard being set, one that did not need to be enforced loudly, one that had already proven itself through action. And when the door closed behind him, the silence that remained was no longer empty. It was permanent, a reminder that in that space, on that day, perception had been corrected by reality, and it had not asked for permission to do so.